Episode 145, Downsizing, Letting Go of Evangelicalism's Non-Essentials. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I am in conversation with Michelle Van Loon, a writer who has put effort into examining evangelical culture from the inside. Her move from Jewish upbringing into evangelical Christianity gives her an insightful perspective on both traditions. We talk about what drew her towards Christianity, what she carried from Judaism, and what she thinks people often misunderstand about Jewish identity and practice. We explore her experiences inside evangelicalism, including patterns of spiritual abuse. Are these isolated situations or symptoms of deeper issues around evangelicalism and revival culture? We cover religious trauma and how others might identify and recover from similar experiences. I ask her what churches might need to let go of, how downsizing can complement deconstruction, and how a downsized community might look. And of course, what her favourite Bible character is. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. I am Matthew. I'm sure you know this voice and maybe even this face by now. I have another author interview. I've read another book. You're going to be listening to this at the beginning of 2026, probably around about February, but it's not yet Christmas by the time I'm recording this. In fact, it's not even November. So we're in the wind down to Halloween while I'm recording this interview. I'm not a reader. I'm a listener. Reading is a really hard thing for me. I read slow. But when I do read a fabulous book, I do delve into it. And this is one of those books that I read relatively quickly. I'm getting used to reading quicker. I'm getting used to taking notes while I read. I'd still rather listen though, but that's just me. I'm a slow reading man. Anyway, my guest today, Michelle Van Loon, she's written a book called Downsizing. In a world of former Christians who love words beginning with D, we have a different word, downsizing. We will get to that word, I promise you. I'm as intrigued by that word as you probably are. But Michelle, you're over in Florida. It's probably warmer where I am here on the west coast of the United Kingdom. How are you and why did you write this book?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and a shout out to all the slow readers. I read really fast, but I don't comprehend the way that a more deliberate reader does. So yay for you. And also, thanks be to God, there are audiobooks. So
Yes, very much so.
that is a win for the people that can absorb via their ears rather than their eyes. So anyway, thanks for having me. I live in Florida, so I'm looking at a palm tree right out my window. And it's summer, 11 and a half months a year here. And it's mostly beautiful, except for 3 or 4 terrifying days some years when we have hurricanes, which are really pretty awful. Anyway, I'm in my 60s, I'm a baby boomer, and I'm at the point of my life where I've put some hard miles on my journey through the church, through trying to follow Jesus. And we're in a time of change, we're in a time of reflection. And this is my attempt as a person who is a lay person who's very serious about Christian history to be able to put some context into this present moment and how we got here and where we might be going. The church is in a time of change. I know there's a lot of triumphalist talk saying that we're on the verge of a great revival and wonderful things are happening. This is what we're hearing in America in some quarters. And I actually think, yes, there are crowds, there are people that use Christian as an adjective for themselves. But that is not the same as, I think, what the core message of being the church of the gospel is. They're two different things. The cultural and political part of what being an evangelical Christian is in America takes us one direction. My book is pushing us to reconsider the other direction.
Thank you for that. Yeah, what I neglected to say was the subtitle to your book is Letting Go of Evangelism's Non-Essentials. Evangelicalisms, shall I say that properly? Letting Go of Evangelicalism's Non-Essentials. One day I'll be able to say that word without stumbling over it. And
You got there.
I
You got there.
I got there. Yeah, this poor little English boy, he got there in the end. Now,
Yeah.
I would describe your book as part memoir, part
Mhm.
guide. Is
Yeah.
that a fair assessment? Is that what you were aiming for?
That's what I was aiming for. And apparently, at least one reader, you got that, but other people have as well. I use my own story um, as a framing device to be able to explore the larger questions of kind of what is evangelicalism. There's a lot of different evangelicalisms
Mm-hmm.
at play in the world. It's not a monolith, and that is also helpful for people, I think. Um, Historian and theologian Phyllis Tickle, who is now, she's now passed, but she observed that about every 500 years, the church, the big church, the big C church, undergoes a time of reformation and a major change. In 500 AD, and in that period, church councils began to form the idea of what the church was like, and suddenly it was legal, and not only legal, it was mandatory to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. Those kinds of things happened in about 1000 AD. The church split from Eastern Orthodox and Catholic. There was a great schism. It had been kind of working and bubbling under the surface for a couple hundred years, but it finally burst into bloom about 1000. In 1500 was the Protestant Reformation, which almost instantly split into several different kinds of Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are kind of overdue for another I don't know if the right word is kind of coming to terms with where we are. There's a lot of unhealthy stuff that has accumulated in evangelicalism. There's a lot of baggage that's accumulated. So we hear, you mentioned the D word, the deconstruction word, which is very kind of au courant right now. People are deconstructing their faith, and they're deconstructing their relationship with the church. And that is legitimate. But I think in many cases, the idea of just offloading a lot of this extra baggage is actually what's at play, particularly for people that still have kind of a core kernel of faith
Mm-hmm.
in God. So deconstruction is the word, but I think that downsizing is often a more realistic approach or more realistic understanding. And it happens on a personal level, but I think it's also happening kind of across many sectors of the church. We can't go on the way we are,
Yeah.
particularly in the West, particularly in America. So,
Yeah, and I think that's a whole series of episodes in itself. That topic.
yeah.
So let's run with that. I get what you're trying to say with that. I'm a fully deconstructed. In fact, I deconverted before the word deconstruction
Mhm.
became a thing. And I remember writing my own blog post more than a decade ago. What do we call this thing that we do? Is deconversion actually a word, or are we creating a new word when we say that? And the DE in the beginning of that very much implies a negativity. You're breaking something down. You're walking away from something. It's a definitive action of negativity, and
Mhm.
deconstruction has the same kind of thing. You're breaking something down with intent. That those are words that have come out, and a lot of people, and I will be honest, and I include myself in that, welcome that negativity because it's breaking down something that we see as oppressive. You know, when the Berlin Wall was deconstructed brutally and violently, the world celebrated, and rightly so. So that would be the analogy I'll go to. But you are taking a much more gentle approach in your talk about downsizing. And by pure coincidence, my wife and I, we've lived in this 4-bedroom house for the past 12, 13 years. And we're talking about our daughter has decided that home is no longer where she wants to live. She wants to have much more of her own autonomy. And as a 21-year-old, that is her right to make that choice. So we're in the process of selling and trying to buy a 2-bedroom flat.
Oh, yes.
So the word downsizing is a big word for us right now. And on more than one occasion, I've used the phrase, downsizing is difficult because we have got accumulated stuff, boxes that have never been opened, boxes that we won't let go. I particularly won't let go of, and boxes that we know should be binned without being opened. And those are the conversations they're having right now. So the metaphor that you use in your own book is not too dissimilar to that. And there are lots of ways you could go with that. There's lots of ridiculous depths you could go to with that whole metaphor of downsizing. So I get what you're trying to say, and it feels to me that you've intentionally used a less destructive word to describe what is essentially the same thing that a lot of people are going through.
It's a slightly gentler version, I would say. Although if you've ever been in a house, like my husband and I have had the responsibility of cleaning out large, long inhabited houses of relatives after they've died, there can be violence in that kind of purge because often there's not a lot of time. There's not the same kind of attachment to memories in those boxes that have never been opened, or crayon pictures from kindergarten or whatever. But the process of letting go and sorting and figuring out what is really meaningful out of all of this has its own violence to it, its own grief to it. And I talk about the grief throughout the book, actually, because it is what you're doing right now physically is really hard, especially if you've been in that house. You said 12 years, was it?
Yes, thereabouts, just over.
A lot of life happened in those 12 years, and a lot of memories, and it's comfortable to know where the forks are, and it's comfortable to know
Yes.
where the kindergarten scribble picture is stored. So having to uproot all of that and condense it to what really matters for what's next is a very, very hard and fraught process. So big empathy for.
Thank you. An amusing anecdote for you on the relationship to this. I know up in our loft, there's a cardboard box full of assorted, non-matching pottery mugs. And these are the kind of mugs that don't belong on display in a good middle-class kitchen. You know what I mean?
I totally.
And these are mugs which, because when I was a single man in my own 1-bedroom bedsit, I collected loads of mugs because people come round and I have to give everybody a mug. And I was very much objected to having 24 matching mugs. So I've got a variety of distorted, not some of them are intentionally misshapen mugs. They're just a cacophony of different mugs of different colours, different sizes, etc. I'm sure anyone can imagine what they're like. And that box of mugs is up in the loft. And I have resisted the disposal of that since before I got married. I've been married over 30 years. those boxes are not allowed, those mugs are not allowed in the kitchen anymore because we're now a good middle class family. Yeah, there is going to be trauma associated with the disposal of those
Yeah.
mugs. I'm going to have to find somewhere to go because those mugs, holding each one of those mugs, brings back memories of my single young 20-something days when it wasn't a problem to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning playing on my computer or playing my music slightly too loud because there was nobody else to be bothered by it. Those are the memories, or talking nonsense with my mates when we've been out to the pub for multiple beers and, you know, we've solved problems that never even existed anyway, and we've talked nonsense for hours about it. You know, this is the life of a young 20-something male and his mates. And these mugs all hold those kinds of memories.
Of course they do. Yeah. Out of those mugs, there may be one or two that you may want to sneak into the keep pile. Just for old time's sake. And I am, you can probably tell from the book that we keep things pretty simple, actually. Here we have downsized, we've moved 13 times, so I've got it down to a science just about, but sometimes it's worth keeping a mug. And
Yes.
maybe to kind of reference my intent in the book, there might be something worth saving. It doesn't all go to the burn pile, but a lot of it can go be donated or trashed or burnt or whatever. But maybe one mug is worth saving. So
Absolutely, there is always a mug worth saving. And if anybody wants a mug,
yes.
you know how to reach me. um, so, what prompted you to write this book is probably the question I really want to ask the most.
Well, I think it is recognizing that the church and our world is in a time of massive transition, both in terms of technology and in terms of politics, the rise in authoritarianism. There's a lot happening that has shifted the world of the 70s or the 90s. We are living in very different days, and the changes are so seismic. Um, and we're alive in them, so we're not feeling it in the same way that someone in the future doing a long view of history would be able to say, oh, of course, there's so much change going on. Because the church, the evangelical church in America, is such a dominant force in both faith and culture and politics, being able to come to terms with kind of how we got here. And we ended up, my husband and I, because of the number of times we've moved and because of other kind of countervailing winds that happened in some of the places we lived, we've been in a lot of different kinds of expressions of evangelical Christianity, from very rigid, rule bound, fundamentalist kind of subcultures to wild, very wild, charismatic and Pentecostal cultures to the big church growth, um, kind of business and science shaped mega churches of places like Willow Creek Community
Mm-hmm.
Church. People around the world recognize that name both for the influence and also for the moral collapse and fall of the founding pastor. I grew up within spitting distance of that church, and I'm originally from Chicago, and there was a lot of different kinds of spiritual activity happening. So I kind of found myself in a lot of different places, like Where's Waldo or or Forrest Gump. So
There were it's definitely parts of your book, and it was the evangelical critiques were the bits that
mhm,
I identified with the most in your book. What I was struck by, and you've managed it really well actually, is you've managed to dispassionately critique
Mhm.
evangelicalism, and there are many people, and I include myself in that, who, when we critique the effects of evangelical Christianity, it's very easy to make it very personal.
Of
Evangelical
course.
Christianity did this to me, and I can reel out a long list
Mhm.
of crimes that evangelical
Mhm.
Christianity has done to me personally as an
Mhm.
individual, and many people share those. What you've done in that part of your book is you've described how evangelical Christianity behaves without making it personal about you, and you've done
Mhm.
it very dispassionately and very factually. And it's not until you get 3/4 of the way through the book where you just slip in that you had the counselling for trauma that
Mhm.
suddenly the penny dropped. And I said,
Mhm.
oh, Michelle suffered all these things as well.
Mhm.
Was it difficult writing it in that way? Was that an intent to write it that way?
Um, it was because of the chronological way in which I told the story, in the different kinds of evangelical spaces that I found myself in. It wasn't until that point in the story that I realized, and because other losses began to happen in my life as I hit middle age, that I realized that I was carrying a great deal of trauma. And I asked myself, and I was pretty depressed as well. I was starting to have suicidal ideation. And so I knew I needed to get some help. My husband actually knew I needed to get some help before I was willing to say, "I need help,"
Mm-hmm.
which is often the case. But sitting down with a counselor who understood something of religious trauma was super helpful as I processed my family of origin story,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of set me up for being a good member of some pretty abusive congregations. The connection for many of us is strong, like we do what's familiar, so we end up sometimes in church systems that have some of the same issues as maybe our family of origin. So that was super helpful for me. But I am also now at this point of my life, I'm 66, and I've had 15 or 20 years on the other side of that counseling to be able to integrate it and make sense of it and continue to kind of understand what I actually believe and who I actually am in this world.
And I think the benefit of the way that you wrote the book is it's possible to read through some of the things that you've written in your book about what evangelical Christianity has done that's negative in the world, because you haven't made it so personal and you've not made it so emotional. It's
Mhm.
possible to read that and acknowledge these as facts without having your own emotional response.
Mhm.
And I think that's very helpful. And like I
I
say,
I appreciate that. That's really meaningful to me. I do have a section at the end, and I reference, at 1 or 2 points in the book, for people that have had traumatic experiences, church hurt, spiritual abuse, clergy sexual abuse. I do have some kind of starting points for people to go and figure out how to get help. The first time that I was in a really abusive church environment, it's, high control, lots of rules, and lots of consequences if you broke those rules, most of which were unwritten, so you
mm,
didn't find out until you broke them.
yes.
Um, surprise, you broke a rule you didn't even know was there. There weren't resources available. There were a couple of books that had come out this happened initially in the '90s. There were a couple of books that had come out, but we live in a world now where there are whole counseling organizations committed to helping people with religious trauma. There's many books that have been written. There's people both within the church and outside the church that are doing work in the area of religious trauma. So we are living in an age where there's much more available for you if you're a person who has had a painful experience and can't quite make sense of it, or is making sense of it and doesn't understand what's happened. There is help out there. It's not as, and with the internet, it's easier to begin to find some of those resources.
Absolutely, and it was really nice to read that section of your book, Michelle. So, quick reminder, listeners or viewers, if I put the video up on YouTube, links to Michelle's book, more information about Michelle, where you can get her other books in the show notes down below, the usual place. There will also be links to resources as well for those of you who want to find out more about religious trauma or treatment for religious trauma. We've done our own podcast here on Still Unbelievable about religious trauma. And the Deconstruction Anonymous Facebook group is a good place to go to if you're concerned about that. But check the resources down in the show notes. There will be plenty there. But moving on from that, and I don't want to belittle religious trauma. It is a very serious subject, very serious topic. Many of us suffer from it. Many of us suffer from it for many years. The recovery from religious trauma is not a single session event.
That's right.
So be gentle to yourself about it. But I would like to move on, because the bit about your book that really hooked me was right up in the opening books, where you talk about your past. And this is where I want to ask a few more personal and more general questions, because I want to learn here from this opportunity, and I'm pretty sure that many of my listeners also do too. You talk about your Jewish history, your Jewish heritage, your Jewish background. You came from a Jewish family, and you were a teenage convert from Judaism to evangelical Christianity. And I don't think I've ever spoken to anybody who has done that journey in my entire life. It does seem to be a rare thing. And because of my history with evangelical Christianity, I know very little about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be part of Judaism, what the difference between the two words are. There is so much, both big and small, that I don't know. So I guess the first question is, what got you to make that journey? And I'm sure that in itself is a big story.
Yeah.
And what do you want people like me to know about what it means, where you came from, and how it was that you made that journey?
I will try to be succinct, because yes, we could do 56 sessions on these questions, and I could invite in the other Jewish followers of Jesus I know, and we would all have a different approach and a different story. I can tell you my story. So I grew up, both of my parents are Jewish. 3 of the 4 were born in Eastern Europe. 3 or 4 of my grandparents were born in Eastern Europe, in the Pale of Settlement, Ukraine, Poland. The borders changed, very often. So where they came from has, depending on the year, it has a different country. But they came to the United States, fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. The ones that stayed behind were swept up in the Holocaust.
Ouch.
So that shadow and that experience was very large in my childhood, without ever talking about it much. It was just there. My parents were, like a lot of American Jews of Eastern European descent, were pretty secularized in a lot of ways, but also maintained proud ethnic Jewish identity. There was some religious observance, but it was spotty throughout my childhood. I was a kid who was always super hungry and super curious about God. And nowhere in my family or in the synagogue that we were connected to, people were not talking about God. I know it sounds weird to say. They were talking about what was happening in Israel. This was in the 60s and 70s. There were wars and rumors of wars and all of that. Um, and anti Semitism and what was happening to Jewish people that were still alive in Russia, and the persecution that was ongoing there. They were talking about those things. Those things were all really important, but I wanted to know God. And I ended up attending a high school that was almost entirely Gentile. And so there were a couple of other Jewish kids. We all knew, we were the weirdos in the Gentile sea. And I had a friend come to school one day. It was the Jesus movement of the late 60s and early 70s. So everyone was talking about God all the time. And she came to school and told me she had become a Christian the night before. And I looked around the cafeteria and I said, but everybody here is a Christian because they're Gentile, right? Like, I'm Jewish and they're Christian. And she said, it doesn't quite work that way. And I really had no idea what she was talking about. But that conversation was the beginning of the journey that I'm still on. I read my Old Testament, got more and more specific about who Jesus might be. She and I smoked weed together and talked about the Bible, which I'm pretty sure is not an approved evangelism technique anywhere. But it was the 70s, man, and that's what
What
we
else are you
did.
gonna do? Yes.
That is what we did. And eventually, an older friend who actually wasn't smoking weed with us said, "Why don't you read the Gospel of John?" Which I've heard maybe isn't the best idea to give to a Jewish person because there's some passages there that have been used for persecution of the Jewish people. But was just, I want to know who Jesus is. The God that I grew up hearing about, he didn't have a son. What's the purpose? So
Hmm.
I was really locked on that. And I read the Gospel of John, and it's the first time I'd ever read it. I had no context, I had no church background. And when I read that Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him, I was like, okay. Like, a light went on. It didn't make total sense, but I made some sort of commitment in that moment that I was gonna follow this one that told me how I could get to know God. It did not go well with my parents when I told dropped this little bomb of news on them. And so they told me as long as I lived under their roof that I was not permitted to go to church. And so I snuck to stuff when I could. I had very good sneaking skills, obviously. I was smoking weed all the time, and I had mastered some pretty good teenage sneaking skills. And I snuck books into the house and I listened to Christian radio programming, and I think they hoped it would starve this out, and it didn't. And so the book begins when I am finally able to attend church for the first time, freely, as an 18-year-old. People are always surprised that in America, in the West, that there can be a that kind of persecution. But if you talk to a Muslim, or if you talk to a more observant Jewish family, or even somebody who's part of the Church of Latter-day Saints and makes a switch, anyone who makes a big dramatic switch is most likely going to get some pushback, especially if the family is very committed to one thing. Now, being Jewish is, there's a religious aspect, there's a racial aspect, and there's a cultural aspect as well. And so it's kind of unique in that way. There's only 0.02% of the world's population is Jewish. So it's not surprising you haven't met, many or any Jewish people, much less out of that percentage. There might be, depends who's doing the counting, 100,000, 300,000 um, people who are like me, who are Jewish. I, I'm Jewish and I am a follower of Jesus. And I tell people if Adolf Hitler was here separating people to go into the ovens, he would not care what claim of faith I said. I could say Jesus is Lord, and I would still be put in line with all my relatives to go to the gas chambers. So that's something that is just part of what it is to live as a human being with those identities for me.
So it sounds like you've got a delicious rebellious streak
Yes.
down in there, Michelle.
Maybe that's why I'm still here, right?
In a way, you remind me of my mother. I'm sure when I thought more about the things that I knew about her after she died and saw some of the photos of her from her teenage years, I think she's about 15 years older than you, would have been about 15 years older than you. There were definitely clues there. I'm pretty sure she was very much into rock and roll when it first broke into the scene in the 50s. So yes, you that little bit, you remind me a little bit of my mum, and that is very definitely a compliment.
I will
Michelle.
take it. Even if you meant it as an insult, I'm like, being rebellious is actually, I think, part of why I still view myself as a follower of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily comfortable in the evangelical world anymore,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't go well with me in the Jewish community because for all kinds of great reasons
Mm-hmm.
and understandable reasons, I'm viewed as a traitor,
Right.
or as a convert who's not actually Jewish anymore.
Right.
Although I can't make that go away, and I don't want it to. Jesus was Jewish, which hello, all
Yes.
his disciples were Jewish also. Jesus was born in the context of a very Jewish story. We start with the genealogies for good reason in the New Testament. So
Yeah. I don't know how insensitive or not it is to ask the question about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, if that's the right.
No. Ask away, man. Ask away.
Okay. Because there is clearly an uncomfortable friction in some areas in the relationship between Judaism and Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not interested in apportioning blame. I'm more interested in how and why that is the case, because the roots are clearly the same. But I certainly remember in my time as being an evangelical Christian, that gave us license to look down on Catholics, look down on Jews, look down on goodness knows how many other people, but Catholics and Jews, two sets of people who we should be more than prepared to embrace, seemed to be the victims of the most perverse types of looking down your noses at. And also you tell very personally in your book that, and you've said it just now, your conversion to Christianity caused its own friction as well. So what's the best way to understand and explain this uncomfortable friction?
Well, I think to go back in church history to the 2nd century, 3rd century, as the young community of Jesus followers became more and more Gentile. I mean, they wrestled from the beginning with what to do with the Gentiles. Acts 15 is a whole conversation as they're trying to figure that stuff out. The letter to the Galatians has, they're trying to figure stuff out. Hebrews, they're trying to figure stuff out. So from the beginning, trying to make sense of that relationship. The first century church did not see itself separate from the Jewish community. It was the Gentiles coming into this community that was confusing and chaotic in a lot of circumstances. But as the numbers shifted, as Christianity spread, it got disconnected from those roots, especially after the fall of the temple in 70 AD. Things changed. And then once Christianity became the law of the Roman Empire after Constantine in the 3rd century, 4th century, then suddenly it was scrubbed often of its Jewish roots. There's always been a little fragment of Jewish believers through history, but they're doing it often at a very high relational cost because the Jewish community is, if you look at what's been done in the name of Christianity to the Jews from, the Crusades all the way to, the Holocaust, all the way to last week's, bombings and all the anti-Semitic incidences that have happened around the world. A lot of it's been done in the name of Christianity. Not all of it, but too much of it. And so I understand that tension. I'm involved in some interfaith kinds of conversations. I'm in a weird place because in those conversations, often, and in those spaces, because evangelicals don't always know what to do with me, and the Jewish community doesn't always trust me, but I can interpret and explain kind of both worlds.
Yeah.
It's not a comfortable place to be, but I recognize that it can be a valuable place to be to help people kind of understand where people are coming from. I've attended seminary. My husband is also a seminary grad, and his mom is Jewish. So even though we've got a very Dutch sounding last name, we bring all of that into who we are, how we raised our kids, and how we show up in a church when we are in church. So
I'd like to follow that up with my memories of being deep into evangelical Christianity means that end times was always a feature on the horizon. And so, yes, I read all the Left Behind books. I devoured them all. And when I look back on it now, and again, correct me if I'm coming to the right conclusion or not, but when I look back on it now, it feels that that segment of Christianity didn't so much as respect Jews as being part of the heritage. Jews were a useful, expendable tool for what they wanted to achieve in the future.
100%. Ding, ding, ding. And I can tell you, even people like me, Jewish people that have ended up worshiping in a church setting, I can tell the difference between somebody who cares about me as a human being and as a Jewish woman versus somebody who sees me as God's end times timepiece that's going to bring about the rapture or bring about the tribulation, that Israel is an idea, Jewish people are an idea. They're not like valued human beings. It's really something. And there's two kind of streams in evangelicalism that don't seem like they have anything in common. One is dispensationalism, which is that left behind kind of, it's very popular. It's shaped American foreign policy to some degree, which is so weird, but yet here we are. And so you have all these people looking at the rapture and saying, oh, The end times began when Israel, the state of Israel, became a state in 1948 or 1973 when they took over Jerusalem, or there's a lot of date setting and anxiety and conspiracy theorying that goes on. That's one stream. The other stream is called supersessionism or replacement theology, which is that the church has replaced Israel. And so all of that 2/3 of the Bible that's the Old Testament, that's just like a really long introduction. And it doesn't really matter. And the church is God's chosen people now. And if you're a Jew, too bad, so sad. So both of those have terrible consequences. They're both anti-Semitic in their own way, although the dispensational side tends to be more, they tokenize Israel or fetishize Israel and the Jewish people. So they tend to be more supportive financially, but Jewish people can tell that they're just a means to an end.
So it's hardly a surprise then that Jews don't trust Christians, because it's justified.
Right. It is justified. And the conversation, for me, it was radical to be able to connect Jesus to the God of the Old Testament that I'd read about and tried to make sense of, in all of those different stories, all the different accounts, that Jesus was connected. Those genealogies arc back into the Old Testament to the beginning of the book. And if God had intended the story to be different, it wouldn't have mattered. Jesus would have emerged in some other context, in some other place, in some other time. But the Jewish story, and that story of chosenness, which kind of offends people, that word makes it sound like God has favorites. That's not the intent of that language. The intent is, for the Jewish people to reflect God's light to the world. And Jesus uses that kind of language. You are the light of the world. I am the light of the world. It's not disconnected from what's come before. So
thank you for that, Michelle. I feel like I need to apologize for my own involvement in that branch of Christianity, because it was only by leaving it that I'm able to recognize these things. And it's quite humbling to hear you say that, and to hear those things validated, and to think, yeah, I was part of that and I never saw it. So to go back to the metaphor and to go back to the book, part of the downsizing is picking up the mug of anti-Semitism that we've just been talking about, and just smash the bloody thing.
That is right. Smash it to smithereens. That one doesn't need to go with you to the new house.
Awesome. Notice the smooth way in which I brought it all back full circle.
Yes, look at you. I love a good metaphor.
It's almost like I've done more than 5 podcasts, isn't it?
Yeah.
So thank you for that. That was useful, and listeners, I hope you did find that useful. And some of those words that Michelle has used just there, check down in the show notes. I'll put links to some of those things, the dispensationalism and the other big words that we use. There'll be some definitions and some meanings for those. So please make use of the show notes. That's what they're there for, and that's why I put them. So I'd like to fast forward again back to a subject that we talked about earlier. Actually, no. Before we get to trauma, let's talk a little bit more about evangelism, because that is the big chunk of what you talk about in your book. And the other thing that you bring up briefly in your book, which we've not yet talked about, is revival. And you talk about revival and how, and you mentioned it earlier in the conversation, and not just in America, but here in the UK, there's a certain well-known podcaster Christian here in the UK who is making a big thing about revival, rebirth of Christianity. here in the UK, and he's been banging this drum for 2 years, and I'm still waiting to see this revival that's allegedly supposed to be happening. So, what is this obsession that evangelicals have with revival, and is this part of the same package that you've been talking about?
That's, I love the way you put that. What is this obsession? Because if you've ever played the the child's board game Sorry, I don't
Oh, I
know.
loved that game as a child. I've not
Yes,
played it since I was a child, but yes, it was a
but
family
you can
favourite.
picture that there were places where you could just zip ahead.
Yeah.
You could just skip a bunch of squares and zip ahead. Same thing with chutes and ladders. You could also um, end up behind and having to start over again. But that's not what we're focusing on. And revival is kind of a jump start where a lot of the work of living faithfully, living in a humble way, serving other people, loving your neighbor, repenting, um, that kind of just gets fast tracked in a large and corporate way. And it's all very fun. Excuse me, lots of goosebumps,
Mm.
lots of everything.
Goosebumps, yes.
Um, and that um, that desire to kind of skip ahead, I think fuels at least some of this talk. Um, I don't see I went through in the book, in a chapter where I talk about revival because revival and revivalism, um, are a big part of what evangelicalism kind of kind of the culture of evangelicalism. Most of what people think of when they think of revival is actually revivalism, manufactured, meant to get an emotional response, meant to kind of herd people in a particular direction. Honest to goodness revival, which there's examples of in the Bible, in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, which at one time was just one book in the Old Testament. You kind of have this whole picture of the people of God had been chastised, they were allowed to go home, they had to do this hard work of rebuilding, and part of the rebuilding was getting to know God and getting to know his ways again, and there was kind of like everybody was in on it, and there were consequences. They had to some of them had to change their marital status and they had to move, and there was a lot of that. There's pictures of what that can look like in the Bible. And in American history, there were periods of revival, the first and second Great Awakenings, that happened in the U.S., Wilberforce in the
Mm.
UK, um, and the Jesus movement, which some people would classify as a revival of the late 60s and early 70s. Um, that's what's happening now has more to do with cultural and political wins than it
Hmm.
does with spiritual humbling, um, and a change of heart, a change of mind, all the things that go along with what the biblical picture of repentance looks like. So,
Yeah, it's very interesting. You phrase it that way because we are seeing a cultural and political movement here in the UK, and I
mhm,
think what is more clear is that here in the UK, that movement is not as strongly linked to Christianity as it is over in the United States.
mhm,
So it's easier to see the separation between
yeah,
Christianity growing or not growing
mhm,
and the worst parts of white humanity, the racism, the entitlement, etc., and the nasty side effects of that, which are definitely growing here in the UK and growing in a very negative way. Yes, I did mean to say it that way. but it's not so explicitly linked to the church here in the
Hmm.
UK. So we do see it as very much as a despicable political movement.
Hmm. It would be helpful if it was disconnected here. The conversation would be different. But because some of the people, some of the architects of some of the things that are happening in the United States right now have been explicitly evangelical in their background and in their kind of what they are, how they present themselves to the world.
Hmm.
Um, it and in America, it's very easy to say, I'm a Christian. I watch the news channel. Um, I'm against immigration. They can go down the list of all these talking points, most of which are not reflective of who Jesus is.
Hmm.
But everybody's doing it. And it feels like a revival. When podcaster Charlie Kirk was assassinated a few weeks ago, I'm using the word because it's been used a lot here in the US. And a football stadium filled with people to sing worship songs and then hear the president say that he doesn't forgive people and they
Yeah, I
cheer
know.
too. Like it's just so, for me, it cost me something to follow Jesus
Hmm.
at a very young age. I did not have the luxury of cultural Christianity when I was not permitted to go to church, when I was in my Jewish home trying to honor my parents. I understood their distress
Hmm.
at my faith, but there was no room for jumping on the bandwagon of a cultural movement. The faith had to be real to survive the that kind of opposition as a young girl.
I guess the question that's coming to me is we've got yourself who went through evangelism, saw the things that needed downsizing, and
Hmm.
moved on to be a better person. And I see the same in the deconverted community, and I do include myself in that, who saw the same issues with evangelism and decided it's time to downsize from that and move on. What is it that differentiates you and me from those who think that evangelism is still a force for good?
Um, I think, given what I've experienced from some of my former co-religionists over the last 10 years, since Donald Trump rose to prominence in the US, and I was a person who was like, I don't understand why you're all embracing this.
Hmm.
They left me. I didn't leave them in the same way. They often talk to me as if I had abandoned my faith in
Hmm.
God because I was not voting the way that they wanted me to vote and cheering the things that they wanted me to cheer. I have a multicultural family, children and grandchildren that we are our own kind of United Nations microcosm in some ways. And I'm not, I just because everybody's doing it and calling it revival is not, I would rather be faithful for the people who've always stood apart, the whether it's a Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Paul or, you know, go down the list of people that were rebellious against the status quo. Jesus himself was as well. I don't feel alone um, out there. I like there's a whole community of people you've even referenced in your deconverted and deconstruction world, that there are a lot of people out there, and the numbers are growing, who are saying, I can't be a part of that
Hmm.
anymore, whatever that means. The labels and my identity are being refined through this and away from just being a part of that herd.
Okay.
So
what does come out in your book, and I'm sure you're not the first person to have seen a pattern, if there is a pattern there, is not just as evangelism, worship, revival, it also seems to have a dark shadow of abuse.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a relationship between the two?
Hmm.
Does one cover up the other? Is one, like a certain president, would do certain things to distract from Epstein?
Yeah.
Is the revival talk a strategy to
Yeah.
divert from abuse, or is it
Hmm.
more sinister than that?
Um, I, the easy answer is it is a feature, not a bug
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, but here's my big but. That but happens in systems anytime that there's a power structure,
Yeah.
and that can be in government, it can be in a parent teacher association in your local school,
Mm-hmm.
it can be in your community. Power and abuse, until we come to terms with what power is and does. It was one of the temptations offered to Jesus
Mm-hmm.
in the desert. It's not a small thing. And in evangelicalism, if you go through the book, there's abuse keeps popping its head up, abuse of power, secrets, cover up. It goes on and on. It's not the only story in the book, but it's an inescapable dominant thread throughout every single kind of evangelicalism that I describe.
Okay. Which brings me on to another D word that you used in your book far fewer times. That's dominionism. And it feels like
Mhm.
that is probably a good thing to bring up at this point. And on to the thing that you said earlier. And yes, listeners, I acknowledge abuse is not an exclusively Christian thing. I've never said that, and I'm not saying that. It is associated with absolute power and it is associated with absolute control. The more absolute, the more the abuse. And evangelical Christianity, which is one of the criticisms that I have of it, does enable that kind of power structure,
Mhm.
which therefore is going to enable that kind of abuse.
Mhm.
So that's when you say it's a feature, not a bug. That is the kind of thing that we're referring to. No, it's not exclusive to Christianity, but Christianity does seem to be very much in favour of the kind of control
Mhm.
structure which results in abuse. And
Mhm.
that is the mug that we need to smash.
Yes, it is. The I like it. I thank you for that clarification because you did it so well. The thing that I have been struck with about the person of Jesus is his relationship with power throughout his life, throughout his ministry. He had access to it. He chose again and again to not pick it up, to not use it. And that level of restraint, um, and that choice surely was painful for him in some way that I will never be able to understand. It's hard when you sit on your hands instead of doing something. It's hard, um, not to exercise power when you can, to choose weakness, to prefer people that are at the margins, to not kiss up to the people who have power, but to tell them the truth. All of that um, is a pattern for me, um, that is encouraging and strengthening. But it also is crazy making because all around me, people are, particularly in the church, are making opposite choices no matter how many times people get hurt or abused. So,
Okay. So I'd like to move on to being a little bit more practical then, Michelle.
mhm,
I see in the deconstruction community many people, and I've seen only this week, I've seen a few of these messages. There are new people coming into the community on a weekly basis. An
mhm,
example, I'm paraphrasing an example message that I have literally just seen in the last few days. I've been thinking about deconstruction only for the past year. I'm still trying to get my head around what's going on. I'm still not sure what I can believe, what I can't believe. Help. You know,
Mm,
and it's such a big plea for help. But this is not a
mm,
unique thing. This is not a one off. These
sure.
people are appearing in communities week by week
Hmm.
by week. They've been struggling in silence and they've eventually decided it's time to speak up because they've realized that they can't do this alone. So, what
Hmm.
do you want to say to the person who's listening to this, who
Hmm.
is there? They've realized that they need to downsize, to use your word, but they don't know what, they don't know how,
Hmm.
they need help just getting their
Hmm.
thoughts together before they roll up their sleeves and do the actual box lifting.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
do you want them to hear?
I want them to hear that they they are loved, that this is valid, that where they are is perhaps a place of great strength, that it takes strength to walk out the door. It takes strength to ask those questions. And I found it was helpful at a point when it all felt too much. And I felt like I was surrounded by a sea of boxes full of mugs that didn't match, to use that picture, to find a counselor. There are a number of really great books out there if counseling is not, something that's accessible or affordable. There are resources, there are places online, groups, just being able to be in a group where you hear you're not the only one, you're not crazy. This happened to me too. I'm struggling with the same questions, or I'm dealing with these emotions. I'm angry, I'm grieving, I've lost my community. All of those things have a sacred place and they matter. I think there's a rise in the evangelical world of some sensitive pastors becoming trauma informed, because they may have a person who floats in the door of their church who could use some help, and not to be fixed and not to be sold and not to be converted or reconverted, um, but just to be welcomed as they are. And any place that you can find a welcome, whether it's an online community like the one you offer, or just another friend that gets it, is important. It helped me to talk to a counselor. It helps me to have friends that are willing to journey along with me through the changes that I've gone through and welcome me right where I am, which is a big evangelical phrase. We say we're always welcoming people
Mm.
right where they are. And to find somebody who will do that is a very powerful kind of healing tool that helps to be able to make sense of the journey and to reconstruct identity and whatever faith actually remains. It might even just be the size of a mustard seed,
Mm.
and that's legit.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
What does that person need to look for when they're in church in terms of trying to find a worship space that is friendly
Yeah.
to the downsizer?
Well, I say good luck. It's rough out there, definitely in America right now, because of the rise of Christian nationalism and the MAGA movement. Here in the US, a lot of churches that were just conservative have gone full full MAGA um, here, and somehow that, if you can find a church that is not involved in politics, but is connected to caring for neighbor and community well, without strings attached, that's, I think, a clue that maybe you're in a place that might be somewhat safe. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe in a church again. My husband and I do attend a church, but we met with the pastor, told him our story, and he's like, well, I get it. Whatever you want to offer here, because he knows we come with a lot of, you know, we've been to seminary and we have all this ministry experience. He's like, whatever you want to offer, we're glad to have. And there's no pressure to do anything else. And we're just glad you're here. I could deal with that.
I guess the cautionary word to people in this situation is just watch your boundaries.
Yep.
Just see where the pokes are, where the nicks are, and if these do not look like friendly people, consider your boundaries. And if you need to hop to another church, that is not beyond the realms of possibility, but just be careful how you go about it.
That idea of being able to trust your gut about what you're seeing in a church, or the language they're using, or is everybody running the church related to each other, and you're dealing with a nepotism kind of leadership structure or whatever. Pay attention to those things. When we showed up at the church that we are currently attending, we said we want to meet with the pastor, and I have a list of about 12 or 14 questions that I compiled to ask really hard questions. When has there been, not if there's been abuse, when has there been abuse in this church? How has it been handled? That's a question. What are you reading? That's a question. How are you dealing with conflict? That's a question. What's, like, all of those things. It's really uncomfortable interviewing somebody, but it's a way for my husband and I to honor the story that we've had and not get fooled again, to borrow the lyrics of a rock song that I probably listened to while I was smoking weed.
I wish I'd met you many, many years ago. You were probably really good fun. But
still pretty fun.
Sorry, that was the wrong adjective there. I do apologise, Michelle. Oh, shame on me. Shame on me.
No shame. No shame.
And there are some questions that we need to have in our mind that we don't actually need to ask. Questions like, what do the women at the front of the church look like?
Right.
Is there a female leader in the church?
I didn't even touch on that, but
are there people of colour in the church? How many are there? Are they sitting in the corner, or are they involved? These are questions that you can answer just by observing the church.
That's right. That's right.
So, oh crumbs! We got through all my more or less. I didn't read my questions in the way that I wrote them, but we've kind of gone through them. I guess one of the questions is, we've talked about individual, but I guess some of it is communal as well. One of the questions I've got here is, what should a church downsize? Because we've talked a little bit on the personal level.
It requires them, the leaders, and not just the people at the top, but to get buy-in from the congregation, to start having some hard conversations about the practices, about the things that they've taught, and to do a fearless moral inventory, just like you have to when you're in AA, to do the inventory, to do that self-examine as a group is like, it's the thing that should happen. I was on staff in a church. I also worked for a couple of different ministries, and you get so busy doing the tasks that there's never time to pull back and to do that kind of reflection. And everybody who studies organizational health, and I'm not just talking about church organizational health, I'm talking about business and nonprofits as well, government. You have to do that, or the downsizing ends up happening for you. At one time in the United States, Sears, the retailer, They sold everything. They were the biggest thing on the planet. I lived in Chicago. Their headquarters were in Chicago. They sent catalogs, multiple times a year with you could at one time even buy houses from Sears, house kits. And Sears is no more. Amazon came along and did it differently and did it better with different technology. And Sears ended up slowly but surely fading and then disappearing. That is the truth for everybody. Churches need to take the time to do that, or it will, in many cases, be chosen for them. The downsizing will happen. Renewal is not guaranteed.
No. And sometimes I wonder if the renewal stroke revival obsession is effectively wallpapering over the cracks rather than
Yeah,
actually addressing the structure.
I agree. I Very good picture.
Yeah,
100%.
it's something that just sits there, and I think there's an element that feel that if they talk about it enough, it will eventually happen.
That's called wish casting.
I love that phrase. I think that must be. I don't think that phrase has made its way over to this side of the pond,
There you go.
but
Let's
it
see if
has
we
now.
can
I'm
turn
going to
it.
find a way to use that again. I
Yeah.
like it. I like it. My daughter will tell me off for using it, but I like it. My daughter is of that age where I'm no longer the coolest person in the world. It's quite a distressing place to be.
You know what? You know what would help that? If you gave her a mug.
I love your thinking. I love your thinking.
You tell her it's from me.
I've done the next best thing. I've agreed to take her to a concert to her favourite band next year.
Oh, nice. Nice.
So there we go. So take that. We're coming to go and see you. Excellent. So I guess on the topic of downsizing and identifying what you can get rid of and what is unhelpful for you either in your life or in the periphery of your life, what haven't I asked that you still want people to know about?
We've covered a lot of ground, actually. Um, I I've written, this is my 8th book. I tell people I have a lot to say. There is kind of a bit of a thread that runs through them, even though it's different subject matter and different publishers. I will always preference the people that are having having questions, struggling, trying to make sense of their faith and their identity, because I'm that person, So I'm writing to myself as well as to them, whether I'm writing about our family history stories or what it is to be a pilgrim or an exile or this. So,
Uh, Thank you. We've done quite a cycle ride the last hour and a half. So we've gone through trauma, we've gone through downsizing, we've gone through abuse, we've touched on anti-Semitism, skirted the edges of racism. We've done the full gamut of evangelism. Is there another big sin in evangelism that we've not yet mentioned that we should highlight?
if I had to pick, it's just the power
Okay.
issue. I feel like so much traces back to that, whether it's sexual abuse by a clergy member,
Mhm.
whether it is the abuse of power, whether it is bad theology, whether it is bad practice. It ends up cycling back to a very unhealthy relationship with power. That's my short answer. You have one question you haven't asked me, and
I
I'm
have.
all ready for it.
You're all ready for it. Well, in that case, let's do it. Thank you, Michelle.
Yes.
I have really had a good time chatting with you, Michelle. You are a very fun individual. I have had plans to come over to the United States, and Florida was definitely on the radar for somewhere to go. My daughter has vetoed that during the present administration.
I I I can respect that. But if you ever come to the US, let me know.
If we're ever over in Florida, because my usual podcast partner Andrew, he's in one of the states just to the north of Florida, so that is the area of the United States we are likely to come across. So it's not impossible, but it won't be in the next 4 years, I'm
Your
afraid.
daughter, I know, or however long this
Yeah,
endures.
we won't use the word dictator just yet.
I'm using it tomorrow because I'm going to a march. But anyway.
All right then. But yes, listeners, show notes, find Michelle's other books, find Michelle's presence on the web, find the book that we've been talking about, Downsizing, how letting go of evangelicalism's non-essentials, because there are some non-essentials. We've all done it in this community of the big D's, deconstruction, deconversion, and even downsizing, which is definitely a much softer way to describe very much the same kind of thing. Don't be afraid of it. Look out for yourself. Be kind to yourself. Watch the warning signs. If you're feeling uncomfortable about something, maybe that's a warning sign. And just look around. Just take a step back. Make yourself safe. And then look at it dispassionately. And maybe you'll see what it was that was bothering you. So, Michelle, I have a habit of asking my guests one last question as a piece of information. I've been daring my listeners to collate it in a spreadsheet, and nobody's offered to do it yet. But anyway, Michelle, do you have a favorite Bible character, and who are they?
I do, and you will tell me if this is a repeat, but my reasons might be different than the person or people who chose before. Mine is the mother of Jesus, Mary. Has anybody picked her?
Once, and the very first person that I asked this question to said Mary, and you're the first person to repeat her.
All right, well, her name was Miriam.
Oh, really?
That's the name in Hebrew. That we're reading Mary as a very anglicized version. It's a lovely name, but Miriam, the reason that I admire her is not because she's in a lot of stained glass and statuary, and not because she's wearing that lovely pale blue garment and looking so placid. I read the Magnificat, which is I wrote it down, in Luke 1, 46 through 55. And these are fighting words. So when you said maybe I'm a little bit of a rebel, I hear in her words and then in the choices she made to back them up, someone who was willing to address the powers that be, someone that was very clear on her own family history, who she was tied to. She recognized the importance that she was a very key link in a chain, and that she was willing to obey. And it looked very radical and irrational. And she was brave. She had chutzpah, to use a good Yiddish word, that I would love to be a measure of that in my life. She loved her son. She didn't always get it. She didn't always get him, but she was all in on the adventure, even though it made her a weirdo in her own family and community at times.
I love the way you've expressed that, Michelle, and the reason why is it runs at odds with the Christianity that I'm familiar with, which sees Mary as a quiet, timid young girl, did what she was told, didn't complain about what was put on her, and almost disappeared, only to reappear at key moments and play a role and then
Mhm.
move on and disappear again.
Mhm.
And you've brought to life, from a culture that you're familiar with,
Mhm.
somebody who actually has a character.
Yes. If you read that passage in Luke 1 and you think about some of what I said, you'll be like, "Oh, yeah. Yeah. She was a spicy one." So, in the best possible way, but, um, I think she stood out because she wasn't a sweet, placid person. Obedience isn't always sweet and placid.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's subversive. So,
Lovely. Thank you so much for your time, Michelle. Thank you so
yeah.
much for your book. I got from your book things I didn't expect to go from your book. I loved learning about you. I loved learning about some of the nuggets of the history of
Mhm.
Judaism that you put into there. Something that I must confess my knowledge is completely lacking. Through no fault of my own, it is my upbringing. It was how I was indoctrinated, and I'm poorer for it. So thank you so much for doing a little bit to address
Mhm.
that balance. Listeners, Michelle's books can be found in the links. I've already said all of that. Check the show notes for all the things that we've been talking about in this. Thank you for listening. This is Still Unbelievable, and until next time. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.